Okay. Good morning. We are on page 34, and I want to say that's where we are, right? Page 34?
That's what I have.
Right, we're on, and I think we're talking about panentheism. And let me go to 158. I can't remember if we read this or not. I want to say we did not. Did we read this?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
All right, well, it's been 2 weeks, so let's go ahead and do a brief update. All right, so remember, we're talking about the doctrine of human being. No, my page flipped. We're talking about what are we doing here, God and the creation. And the first example that we talked about was theism. Right? And remember, some of these things have aspects of what we would say, yes, that is true, but they're kind of, incomplete in ways. So theism, God creates us, but it really doesn't show that much interaction between us and God. We talked about pantheism, right? That God is in everything, right? And that radiates outwards. But then we get to panentheism, and that's what we're going to read now. So in panentheism says that everything that exists is in God. The world is in God, and God is in the world. So if you look at the figure under panentheism, you have the world, and then God surrounds it. Do you need? Okay. So, of several possible versions of panentheism, the version proposed by contemporary Reformed theologian Jürgen Moltmann is proposed. This version proposed is perhaps the most impressive attempt to find a way for Christian thinking about the relation between Creator and creation that preserves the strengths and avoids the weaknesses of both theism's emphasis on God's transcendent existence apart from the world, and of pantheism's emphasis on immanent presence of God in the world. According to Moltmann, God, who is all in all, the only reality there is, made and continues to make room within God's self for life different from God. This means, as theism insists, that the world is always dependent on God and can never be confused with God, but also means, as pantheism insists, that God is never separated from the world, but always at every moment dwells within it as a source of its life. The best analogy for this understanding of this revelation between Creator and creation, Moltmann suggests it's not the creative power of a father who engenders and rules over life outside himself, but that of a mother who makes room for and nourishes new life within her own body, like as a child within a womb. Christian panentheism is one way of proclaiming the good news that our God really is omnipresent and ever-present. It is also one way of proclaiming good news about our own lives. All right, so that's Moltmann is trying to take panentheism and try to explain how this can possibly work. Right? And so what Moltmann does is he looks at the first two models, points out their weaknesses, and says, instead of looking at it as a father who creates, think of a mother who creates within a womb. And these examples, there are mothering examples from especially the Hebrew Scriptures, which surprises many people, especially who think that the Hebrew Scriptures are much more paternal and fire and brimstone, and yet God is often described as a nurturing mother. So Moltmann is building a case for panentheism. So in the last analysis, neither theism nor pantheism nor panentheism can explain the mystery of the relation between the Creator and the Creator's good creation. So what Guthrie is now saying is all of these things have their strengths. But according to Guthrie, and remember, this is Guthrie's book, so Guthrie has free range to lay out his opinion. He's pointing also out their weaknesses. Each of these theories or models says some important things and leaves other important things unsaid. What is important is that we criticize and learn from each of them in a light of biblical witness to a creator who always, with all creatures, is a transcendent God, powerfully independent of the created world and everything in it, yet also an immanent God who in self-giving love is present and at work in the created world and everything in it. Right? So Guthrie is saying we must look at both sides and make sure both sides are emphasized. Very similarly to how Guthrie would say when you talk about God's love, you must talk about God's what? Justice. And when you talk about God's justice, you must talk about God's love. Right. You cannot just talk about one or the other. Right. And this is where he would say if you're only talking about justice and no love, like a God who is like, hurling down lightning bolts every time we misstep, well, that's not the God from the Bible. Or if you're only talking about a loving hippie God without talking about justice, your whole concept of social justice falls apart, right? Because social justice, when you think about what Jesus would do and how he preached and that soapbox he was always standing on for the least of these, and when he goes into the temple and cleanses, the temple area because he sees injustice, you miss the boat again, right? So it's important to look at both sides, always. And this is what Guthrie is saying here, that it cannot be too strong in one camp, because then you're pigeonholing God and not looking at the entirety of this relationship between God and humanity. God's good creation. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. Genesis 1:31. The created world is good, and life in it is good. They are good because a good God made them, continues to give them life, and promises them new life. We have already emphasized as strongly as possible that all that God created is good, not just human beings, but also the world of our natural environment and all life in it. And we have emphasized that this means that we are to respect, value, protect, and work for the welfare of the whole created world. Now we will concentrate on what it means for us to recognize specifically human life as God's good creation. It is true that we human beings, like no other creatures as far as we know, rebel against our Creator, misuse God's good creation, and make ourselves and others miserable because of our rebellion. And I like how Guthrie says, as far as we know. Immediately after creation, the story is the beginning of the long story that still continues, of human sin and its consequences. But neither the Bible nor genuinely Christian theology says that God's good creation has become a bad creation, right? So nowhere in the Bible does it say this. The evil that invades God's good creation is not stronger than the Creator. It cannot change the essential goodness of what God creates. So before we try to understand the evil that is an intruder in God's world, we must try to understand what it means to believe that despite everything that spoils and corrupts it, we live in a good world, and it is good to be alive in it. It means in general that, unlike some other religions and unlike some common perversions of Christianity, the Christian faith is a world-affirming and not a world-denying faith. Christians do not affirm the world because they are optimistic about the world as such and unrealistic about all the suffering or injustice in it. They affirm it because God created it and says yes to it. Even when evil invaded it and seemed to gain control over it, God did not abandon and turn against the creatures who had turned against their Creator. In the life and death of Jesus, God entered into the fallen world to suffer with it and for it. In the resurrection of Jesus, God reclaimed what had already belonged to God and asserted again God's powerful and loving lordship over the world. For the world in the future, God promises not only a new heaven and a new earth. Christians then are world affirming because they believe in a world affirming God. To seek escape from worldly life and worldly responsibilities and pleasures is to seek escape from God. Otherworldly spirituality may seem very pious, but it is not Christian. It is pious rebellion against God, the creator of heaven and earth and everything in them. So let us look more specifically at two of the characteristics of the worldly Christianity that follow from the Christian doctrine of creation. So Guthrie affirms that, yes, there is evil in the world. To not affirm that, you walk around with blinders. There is, no doubt. But he describes it as what? The evil that has come in.
Invaders.
An invader. Perfect. You picked that one word out of that huge paragraph. Excellent. Is an invader, right? And think about it, right? It kind of comes in and it's invading creation. Because Guthrie affirms that even though there's evil in the world, even though an invader has come into creation, creation is still good. It is still created by God. So that includes humanity, it includes animals, it includes plants and trees and everything in it. It's God's creation, right? So Guthrie says, even when humanity acts up, even when humanity is wrapped up within this and does evil things, God does not abandon, right? You think about the examples within the Hebrew Scriptures. What are some examples in the Hebrew Scriptures of this? And there are plenty. So it's kind of like, throwing a dart at the side of a barn. What are some examples?
The various kings.
Yeah.
Good king, bad king.
Yes.
Good king, bad
Perfect
king.
example. Yeah. How many times do they build up Asherah poles and places, the high places, and one king comes in, erects them, the next king comes in, knocks them down, the next king comes in, builds them bigger.
It's all in the annals of...
And it's all in the annals, right. If you don't believe me, they're in the annals, right, exactly. You think about Korah's rebellion. You think about Moses coming down from the mountain and everyone's dancing around a golden calf. And they've only been out of Egypt for like 10 minutes. Moses is like, what's going on? Are you kidding me? I've been up there working all this time and you're down here with this golden calf. You think about these examples, and then you can't just say, well, these are only from the Hebrew Scriptures. As Jesus dies on the cross, that he was put on that tree by the Gentile powers and the Jewish ruling authorities, he says what? On that cross, the people who nailed him to that tree, what does Jesus say?
Forgive them, they don't know what they're doing.
Forgive them, they do not know what they are doing. He doesn't say, oh, when I come back, you're all going to get it. He says, Father, forgive them, they do not know what they do. Right? And this is the one who is ready to die on this cross. So we see this. We see that God does not abandon humanity, even though humanity, at many different turns is ready to abandon God. So what Guthrie is saying, don't give up on this. Don't escape. Don't try to escape from this. God is still here. God is still with us. Do not try to escape, because God doesn't. God is here for the long haul. So we should be too. All right? So when you think about God's creation, it is, the way it is now is messy. It's like my son's bedroom. It's just chaos. But when we think about it, it's a controlled chaos. Even though it is messy, even though sin has invaded God's creation, God is still here. And if we seek God out, God will respond. And God is here. God has not abandoned us. And so Guthrie, is saying we need to stick this out. We need to stick this out, that God is still here and God has not abandoned us. And so Guthrie says he says he's going to build this up, his argument in 2 points. So the first is bodily, physical life is good. Guthrie says, dualistic religions and a falsely spiritual Christianity have always been suspicious of the body. In contrast, a biblical-oriented faith is shockingly materialistic. What is Guthrie talking about? What do you think he's talking about?
All the heresies about, the evil of the flesh and
Good. Yes, the Gnostics.
Gnosticism.
Right. Because Gnosticism, works off of Platonic theory, right? And Plato taught, there's a spirit inside or a soul that is pure goodness, and this sarx, this flesh that is pure evil, is imprisoned. The soul is imprisoned within it. And so when as you're walking down the street in Athens and you trip on a block and you fall and you hit a block and die, your soul is released to go somewhere, right? But the goodness is now gone from the body. So the Gnostics, as you have now Christianized Gnostics, who would believe that Jesus appeared good and he was good, and if he was good, well, then he could not have what? He could not have flesh. He could not have a body. So Jesus only appeared to eat with you. He only appeared to be nailed on a cross because, well, he didn't have a body. And so this Gnosticism, which, becomes prominent as a major heresy, because God forbid Jesus have a body. Well, we know that that's horribly bad. Right? But now if we take what Guthrie has just talked about, God creates us, and if we're created by God, can we be bad? According to Guthrie, according to theology, no, we cannot. Doesn't mean that our actions cannot be bad. It doesn't mean that we can easily fall down and do things that we should not be doing. That's not what I'm saying. But we, in essence, humanity is not evil. We are created by God, therefore we are good. Just like every other animal, just like every tree, even the mosquitoes that we curse. It's all created by God, right? So Guthrie would say part of what God made and pronounced very good is humanity itself, sexuality. We think about the creation story. The plants and trees were created by God to provide food, to sustain our body. We think about the prayer. What do we pray for? Give us this day our what?
Daily bread.
Our daily bread. Why do we need daily bread? It's very easy. Yeah, because we get hungry.
Right.
And for some of us, we get hangry. So to spare people around us, we need to eat. Or else.
Fuel for our bodies.
Yeah, fuel for our bodies. So there are the material things that are important and that are not bad. Sexuality takes a beating, and a good deal of this really comes from Augustine, which is really sad because Augustine, 98% of what Augustine taught is fantastic, and then for whatever reason, because he did like to party a lot in his old life, so maybe that's why sexuality takes a beating from Augustine.
Maybe because he never forgave
Himself. Yeah. And yet, we are told to procreate, or else there'd be no people. That's just science, ladies and gentlemen. That's just the way it is. So Guthrie would say bodily, physical life is good. We are told to eat. Ecclesiastes. I mean, it's a beautiful book from the Hebrew Scriptures, right? Teaches us to find the beauty in the simplicity of life, right? What's the famous line that we drag out of Ecclesiastes, right? Eat, drink,
And
and
be
be
merry.
be merry, right? Eat, drink, and find happiness. Eat, drink, and love God, right? See the beauty in God. See the beauty in the simplicity of life. And so, there are the things we will always need: food, shelter, water. These things we will always need, or we will not exist, right? And they are not bad, right? So we need to stop beating on the physical, right? The sensual part of what it means to be a human being. It is what it is, right? We need to eat. God tells us in Genesis, to be fruitful and multiply, right? So, this is what humanity does.
Yeah.
These are not in itself bad.
It's
Right.
when they're misused.
It's when they're misused, right? And that could be anything physical, right? And of course, everyone automatically jumps on the sensual, but it could be gluttony,
Yeah.
food. It could be anything. It could be alcohol.
Right.
It doesn't outlaw drinking in the Bible. It just says something about getting drunk, right? So it's saying that, I guess temperance is a big thing. So the bodily, physical, Guthrie says, is important, but Guthrie also says temporal life is good. Temporal life is good. The Hebrew Christian faith declares the good news that the history of the world and every individual has meaning, contradicting the pessimistic Greek world view. All right? So, when we think about the scriptures, in the Hebrew scriptures, when we learn about the Israelites, the tribes, think about what a good deal of the law does. It separates the ancient Hebrews from the other tribes in their region. So, there are lots of things that we can say, well, not eating pork was good because they didn't have a way to refrigerate and, they would have gotten sick from the pork. Well, yeah, sure, but, unrefrigerated beef will do the same thing to you. You get sick from that also. But if you think about it, and if you look at many of the Levitical laws, they're separating them. Like they'll say, don't tattoo yourself to honor the dead. Well, what's such an interesting, weird law is that? Well, this is proof that there were tribes around them that would do just this, right? Do not boil a calf in its mother's milk. And we sit back and say, where did that one come from? Well, these things probably, most likely, come from the tribes around the Hebrews doing just these things. And to say, well, these things might not be bad to us, or it might be bad to us, that doesn't weigh into this. It's God separating the Hebrews, saying, okay, well, that's cool, but I don't want you doing that. I don't want you eating shrimp. You can eat all this other stuff, but you can't eat shellfish. Or you can't eat pork, right? So it's a separating. And a lot of the things with the New Testament is similar to this, right? So you say, well, we live under the law of Christ, right? We are free from the Hebraic law, the Mosaic law, yes. But it doesn't mean that, well, now we go out and, live like we're hanging out in Tombstone, walking out of a saloon. We still have to have guidelines, right? And one of the things that the New Testament does is it takes into consideration that worldview, right? Think about some of the teachings of Jesus. Think about some of the teachings of Paul. It is still to separate, right? The church, we think of the church and we are pulled out of the world, right? To be a saint, right? We are pulled out of the world. We are in the world, but we're a part of the world. We're pulled apart from it. We're separated. Right. So when you think of that, it makes sense what Guthrie is saying. Life in times has always been a problem for human beings. Some ancient Greeks thought that the life of every person and the history of the world are meaningless, hopeless repetitions of the cycle of birth, decay, suffering, and death. There is no point in being concerned about life in this world, either for myself or for others. For it is at best fleeting and doomed sooner or later to come to an end. Serenity and meaning can be found only by being indifferent to what happens in the world, stoically accepting the futility of historical existence, contemplating only eternal truths now, and hoping to escape to a better world when we die. Into this pessimistic Greek world came the Hebrew Christian faith, declaring the good news that the history of the world and of every individual does have meaning. It is true that all human beings are born, grow old, suffer, and die, or suffer and die before they have a chance to grow old. It is true that empires and nations rise and fall, but it is also true that there is a loving and powerful Creator who stands in the beginning and at the end of history of the world and of every human being in it, and who works out of the Creator's purpose for their good in their history. So when you think about, some of what the Greeks taught, right, and there are Christians, modern-day Christians, who believe in this type of escapism, right, whether it be talking about the rapture, and, I'm getting out of here, I'm going home, I'm getting, this world doesn't make a difference to me, it's all about heaven. And I hate to say this, but this is, in my opinion, a heresy. We are to look towards the kingdom, most definitely. Yes, Jesus talked about the kingdom. It is our future. It is beautiful. There is no pain. We are to live with God. That is true. Yes, we look toward that. But, and there's a but, life is also here. This is our home. When Jesus talks about the new world, where is the new world going to be? Right here.
Well, Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is here.
Is here, yeah. Exactly. Is on this place. We don't go, we don't get on a train and go to some other universe, right? It's to restore what creation was supposed to be to begin with. Yeah? And so we're here, and if it's all about escapism and not going through trials, tribulations, and pain, well, why would Jesus have to do that? And we would escape from that? Or, why would Jesus teach for 3 years if this world means nothing? But he did. He taught for 3 years, and he was on soapbox after soapbox after soapbox, talking about caring for people, talking about the least of these, talking about do not abuse each other, talking about loving each other, talking about looking for justice. I mean, you think about these sermons and these teachings, whether they be sermons or they be parables or healings, it is Jesus trying to make life better and to teach his followers to try to make life better. It is all about being a servant. If this world doesn't make a difference, why would he teach that? What's the sense? It's a waste of time then. But it's not to Jesus, right? So Jesus at the Last Supper says, sit down, take off your sandals. I need to wash your feet. Why? Because I'm teaching you how to be a servant. Because when you go into this world, you don't look to be served, you serve. And this is God washing people's feet. Think about that. That's powerful stuff. It's so powerful that Peter got it. And Peter said, whoa, 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 whoa. No, I should be washing your feet. And Jesus said, look, dude, you need to sit down. You don't let me do this, you're not worthy to go out there. And then he says, well, then give me a bath. Jesus. I love Peter. I love him to death. You do that at the house. I just need to wash your feet. So when you think about that, there were different cultures who had very pessimistic outlooks on this life. And when you look at life itself, it's understandable. It's understandable. And cultures that had it rough typically had rough outlooks, or they had rough outlooks even on the afterlife. It is what it is. And that people had it rough. Their gods were rough, right? They weren't loving. You had to appease them, right? If you're in Rome and your crops are failing, it's because you made Ceres really angry, or if you had a great bountiful crop that year, well, you did something right. You know, so this is the outlook, and so temporal life is good, right? We are to live life as if life is good, and not thinking that this life here is bad, because that's just heretical, according to Guthrie. All right, it's 9:27. We will, next week, we'll knock off this section and begin our next section. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.